national order. He's also co-editing a book for Cambridge on, basically it's one of those Cambridge companion volumes, Cambridge Companion to Indian Politics and Society. Now, in the longer introductory note that he had provided, he had also written to me saying his research and teaching strengthen critical approaches to ordering global development politics. He does this through 3 projects: the politics of inclusive growth in the global south, the competitive politics of hope across the global south and global north. I don't know what that means, but we can ask him that. And the impact of rising powers on the global order. So, Indrajit, I'm really happy you are here. The floor is yours, 45 minutes roughly.
That's fine. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me at the end? Yes. I'm very grateful, Pratyush, for this invitation. As was mentioned, my first book talk ever was done here. So it's nice to come back and talk about a book that seems very different from what I had talked earlier. But you know, those who might have been there at the previous talk will see there's a recurring theme, the theme of power. But we'll come to that in a bit. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our open access edited book, which, as was mentioned, is called Rising Power, Limited Influence, the Politics of Chinese Investments in Europe and the Liberal International Order, which, if all goes well, if England has enough paper to print, we should see this by the end of the year. If not, I don't know. October 2023 is the deadline that the press has given me, by which time they said they will have the book out. The volume emerged from a very unlikely collaboration between scholars of politics, international development, comparative politics, international political economy, and global development. So it's very, very interdisciplinary. We started life as the Politics of Chinese Investments in Europe network, the Policy network, with some funding from the UK Political Studies Association and the University of York. We held our first meeting in the summer of 2019 at York, a second meeting in London, and things just fell in place after that. We had actually not met as a group while the book was being compiled and put together. So we're just very lucky that we had a great group of collaborators, and their names and the chapters that they've contributed are listed here. So in terms of the problem that we were sort of addressing, and this audience will be familiar, few things have gripped observers in recent years as the rise of China. Whether it is that country's success in lifting record numbers of people from absolute poverty, or its emergence from a rural backwater to being the workshop of the world, China's meteoric rise has dazzled supporters and critics alike. Its rise has been associated with anxieties about the emergence of a Sino-centric world order, which creates worries about the very survival of what is called the liberal international order. And we'll come in a bit to what exactly the liberal international order claims to be. Since 2012, China has become one of the world's top 3 countries as a source of overseas foreign direct investment. Driven by its going out strategy and the Belt and Road Initiative, which of course has been much in the limelight, China is expected to continue the expansion of its overseas investments. Through these investments, it is expected not only to boost its own economy, but also further project its power by leveraging its economic strength. Significantly, China's overseas investments do not only expand its footprints to the so-called developing countries of the global south, they also extend to the developed countries in the global north. For example, between 2003 and 2012, China's overseas foreign direct investment to Europe tripled. Since then, that flow has fluctuated, but despite its fluctuation, there is nevertheless an existential crisis in Europe about Chinese investments, because critics have suggested that China was invading Europe, taking it over, buying it up, fomenting a scramble for Europe. So all sorts of terminologies were being used to describe China's growing footprint in Europe. Now, our book is a response to these anxieties. Its focus on Chinese investments in Europe is significant for several reasons, as we argue in the book. For one thing, Chinese investments upend the usual direction of financial flows from the developed countries of the global north to the developing countries of the global south. So here you have for the first time a country that has been usually associated with the global south, a country that the World Bank still refers to as a developing country, which is now going out, so to speak, and investing in the global north. Europe prides itself and is widely considered to be the champion of the liberal international order, and the increasing volume of economic investments originating in one of the world's most resilient autocracies, where the state permeates the market, towards a Europe where liberal values are itself increasingly besieged from within, offer us, we feel, quite useful insights into how China's actions might or might not influence the international order. Now, analysts fear that that China's growing economic footprint in Europe and elsewhere undermine liberal values, democratic practices, and the rule of law. Our book addresses these fears by reflecting on three questions. What are Chinese and European preferences vis-a-vis the liberal international order? That's the first question we address in the book. The second, what domestic factors shape the politics of Chinese investments in Europe? And third, how do Chinese investments in Europe reshape the international order, if they do? Now, reflecting on these questions on China's power in Europe requires us to move away from understandings of power as a resource to power as influence, which relates resources to outcomes. So in the book, we argue that to assess China's impact on the international order, we have to appreciate the ways in which its growing power resources are or are not translated into actual policy influence. And here we find the very useful distinction that is offered by Evelyn Goh between an understanding of power that is limited to resources and latent capability, which usually involves scorecards of military, economic resources, for example, towards thinking of power that focuses on its effective exercise or influence over the behavior and preferences of other actors. So, leveraging this insight, our volume builds on a political economy literature that situates states within the broader field of social relations. We use the concept of state-society complexes to appreciate the embeddedness of states in configurations of social power. So in emphasizing the value of state-society relations, we are really thinking about what IR scholars would call second image explanations, which look at domestic politics as a source of cooperation and competition in the international world order. So such explanations help us to appreciate the agency of state and social actors in Europe while negotiating with their Chinese counterparts. And here we draw on work that has been done on Chinese investments in Africa, for instance, where scholars talk about the ways in which African states and societies negotiate with Chinese investments. So it's not a one-way process, it's a two-way process that really leads to both states and societies in Africa or in various African countries engaging with states and societies in China. So it's that framework that we've drawn on. Discussions on China's influence, we argue in the book, are impossible without a consideration of the preferences of the actors in the countries where Chinese investments go. And in this context, we are thinking about European actors. So analysts who write about the politics of Chinese investments in Europe or Africa or South Asia or Latin America or anywhere else ignore those local preferences and behaviors at their own peril. So our volume thus contributes to a growing body of literature that emphasizes the role of agency, state agency as well as societal agency in international affairs and global politics. Our contributing authors therefore drew on their specialist country knowledge of several European states and societies to examine these themes. And I want to say a bit here about the methods that we followed. So the mode of influence that we explore in this volume emerged through empirical observation as well as process tracing. Given the access to and knowledge of target actors, complex decision-making processes within states and the underlying state-society complexes, required by the analysis that is offered here. So most of our contributors were country specialists. We were very clear that they had to be country specialists. And they investigated the impact of China's presence in their respective countries of specialization and charged the influence of these impacts on the liberal international order. Additionally, we have a group of China specialists from among our contributors who help us understand China's domestic state-society complexes in order to see what are China's preferences. We often assume what China's preferences are, but it's useful to understand what China's preferences are, and based on the understanding that there are numerous actors within China who might shape that country's preferences as well. So we've used what qualitative researchers would call a diverse approach to descriptive case studies. So the case studies are descriptive and they are diverse, and we've leveraged the varieties of capitalism literature, which looks at different kinds of capitalism across Europe and world over as well. And our cases involve what you might call the most liberal market economies, such as Britain, more coordinated market economies in Central Europe, such as Germany, and what researchers call the more dependent market economies, or the post-socialist market economies in Eastern and Southern Europe. So our cases cover a range which include Britain, Germany, Italy, Greece, the Western Balkans, Poland, and Hungary. Our authors were asked to do 6 things. First, to identify on the basis of their specialist knowledge of the countries, the extent to which those countries' existing preferences converged with or diverged from the liberal international order. Second, to examine, based on their expertise, on the bilateral relations between China and the relevant country, the extent to which Chinese investments were actually translating into political influence or not. Yeah. So that was the second. The third was to trace the processes through which key actors in states and societies of the targeted countries negotiate China's influence. So the assumption is not that there is a one-way relationship, but there's actually a two-way conversation. Fourthly, to analyze whether the political influence exerted by China results in the formation of new preferences or the consolidation of existing preferences within the target countries. Fifth, whether these new preferences, if there were any, diverged from or converged with China's preferences. And finally, to link them all up, and I'm sorry that's got sort of cut off, I think, to analyze the implications of all of these interactions on the liberal international order. So the aim was really to think about using the framework of state-society relations within China and within the host countries, the countries that are hosting Chinese investments, to see how these two link with each other and what influence they might have on the liberal international order. Now, just to give a sense of what we are arguing, it might help, I think, to sort of put down what the prevailing arguments are when one thinks about Chinese investments anywhere, and China's investments and the influence of those investments on the liberal international order. Of course, this audience will know that since 2012, the Chinese government, led by President Xi Jinping, has abandoned its traditional foreign policy, which was about keeping a low profile, biding your time, and has embraced a strategy of striving for achievement. You go out and do things. In recent years, China has portrayed itself as a staunch champion of liberal globalization. So China talks of itself as a provider of public good. It talks about the BRI as a platform for international cooperation. And President Xi has defended multilateralism, globalization, free trade, said he's a champion of growing an open global economy, upholding multilateralism, etc. At the same time, contradictions abound. As we know, China's domestic behavior is not always an embodiment of liberal globalization. If anything, under President Xi, there's been a clampdown on whatever domestic democratic freedoms might have existed earlier. There's growing tension between China and the US in the South China Sea. where China continues to build artificial islands. The European Union appears to be very frustrated with the way in which China's illustrated its behavior in the region, and has often referred specifically to China as a systematic rival which promotes alternative models of development. Public opinion in Europe vis-à-vis China is at an all-time low, especially after the pandemic. And again, Europe is probably not an exception because there has been a general nosediving of public opinion around China. So you have these contradictory sorts of understandings about China. One as China as an upholder of multilateral governance. On the other hand, China as a systematic rival. So it's not about what President Xi wants, but it's just about how China itself, whether it likes it or not, will impinge on the liberal international order. And this has led to proliferating arguments on China's influence on the liberal international order. And here it's probably useful to pin down a definition of the liberal international order. It's a term that has been used often, but I think it might just be useful to pin down what we mean by the liberal international order. And here we have these 5 characteristics that have been often argued in the literature to define the liberal international order. Where you think firstly about openness in trade and exchange, being a defining feature of the liberal order. The second relating to rules-based relations between states. The third relating to collective security. The fourth, which relates to the conviction that international society can be reformed, which means states can work together to achieve collective betterhood. And fifth, that you will, at the end of these sorts of changes and interactions, have a world which is embraced by the warm glow of liberal democracy. Now, these are the ideas underpinning the liberal international order. One is not saying that this is exactly what happens, but this is what a commitment to the liberal international order suggests. So, most studies that look at China's influence on the liberal international order tend to fall into 2 categories. The first, which would draw on the realist understanding of international relations and of the world order, which schematically speaking would suggest that conflict is inevitable. And here the argument is twofold. One, that rising China will inevitably challenge other regional orders that exist in Asia, whether it's in its immediate neighborhood of East or Southeast Asia or South Asia, and we have experts here who sort of have been following that relationship, but also beyond Asia, where the rise of China, the realists would argue, means a return of great power rivalry, where you have a Sino-US rivalry that becomes inevitable. So that's the realist position, that conflict is inevitable. A competing position to the realists is the liberal position, which suggests the opposite, that peace is inevitable. And here they would talk about the openness of the liberal international order, how it is a very resilient order and it's able to accommodate all sorts of challenges. After all, it was able to accommodate the USSR, and when the USSR collapsed, it was the liberal international order that sort of won over. And it's well institutionalized. So the liberal international order is not just about American dominance or European dominance, it's about a well-established system of multilateral organizations. The liberals would say, well, the US power remains quite strong and the US remains very influential, so in some ways they will ensure that peace is retained. And they would draw our attention to the fact that China is unable to, or unwilling to, or both, actually establish its own alternative order. So China is quite happy with the existing order. So these are the 2 broad sorts of arguments around China's rise and its influence on the liberal order. One, the realists who suggest that conflict is inevitable. The other, the liberals who say peace is inevitable. I mean, these are schematics. Obviously, there's a lot of difference within scholars who say, well, this, but that, But in broad strokes, this is the argument. Now, we found these arguments to be useful, but they rely on notions of power that focus on military, economic, or ideational resources. So it's about your capabilities, it's about your rates of growth that really determine what power is and how power is exerted. We also think that a lot of the conclusions that realists and liberals would offer us are at best speculative. Because for the realists, for instance, you have assumptions of conflict. So the assumption that there will always be conflict, and there is a speculative element to how much the liberals talk about, the realists talk about conflict in the future. China and the US will engage in conflict. There is a coming conflict. There is a coming war. But we don't know quite exactly what's happening now. Likewise, with the liberals, there's the argument of a coming peace. China will be sort of, involved and sort of assimilated within the liberal order. Now, you see with the realists, there's an assumption of conflict, but if you look at how things have gone, there isn't really a war between China and the US now, and not one likely anytime very soon. Likewise, the liberal assumption of peace, China's rise has been anything but peaceful. So it's not led to war, but it's not exactly what you would call peaceful. We told about a coming Chinese world order, but China has not yet, at least, overthrown the liberal international order. So there's a great deal of speculation that one sees, but we don't really know what's going on now if we follow those perspectives. We also think that the existing arguments neglect the effect of power. So there's a lot of talk about power without really thinking about the effect of that power, and really only focusing on the material resources, on the latent capabilities, rather than how those capabilities translate into the into influence over the preferences of the others. And by neglecting the effect of power, the existing arguments ignore the agency of states and societies where China invests or where China extends its presence. So, of course, those perspectives are extremely useful because they help you map out what to expect in the future, but they're not extremely useful when you think about how other actors, whether in states or in societies, negotiate with China's presence. So, what are our arguments? If you sort of, those are the prevailing arguments. What are our arguments? And just to sort of frame this part of the presentation, I don't know whether it's clear at the back, maybe not, but the book has 3 parts to it. And the first part of the book really focuses on China's own preferences and what is it that China really wants. And our first argument, which is what we've outlined in the first part of the book, is that Chinese overseas investments are a product of a very messy domestic political economic constraints, rather than informed by a grand strategy of world takeover or even of establishing ideological domination. How do we do this? The 2 chapters in this part, one by Yu Ji and the other by Ran Hu, who are both familiar with Chinese sources and Chinese language sources and have used Chinese language sources rather than their English translations, adopt what they call an inside-out approach and examine actual policy making with reference to the Belt and Road Initiative. So they both look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is alleged to be this grand design for world takeover. And Yu's chapter uses a bureaucratic politics model to explain the very intricate relations between the different bureaucracies in China who are constantly squabbling over the Belt and Road Initiative. So rather than this being President Xi's grand plan, there are actually a lot of local domestic politics between different bureaucracies at different levels within China that make the BRI what it is. Yeah. So it's a very bottom-up way of thinking about the BRI, which Hu tells us is actually extremely fragmented and contested. So it's not a grand plan that has been parachuted in, but if you look at the domestic politics between different provinces as well as between the center and the provinces and the local level, you see that it's a much more complicated effort that's going on there rather than a grand plan to challenge the liberal international order. And because it is such a messy, inchoate process, Chinese investments also generate a very messy, inchoate response. And that's what part 2 and 3 of the book looks at. So in part 2, we talk about the ways in which Chinese investments may in fact strain the liberal international order. We are not suggesting that it's all very nice and it's all a sort of great collaborative sort of thing that's going on between China and the liberal international order. But it's much more complex than a straightforward sort of China threatening the liberal international order. So in part 2, we have chapters 6 and 7, which look at the ways in which China's investments may shape institutions and norms in the host countries. And here, for instance, they would tell you, chapter 6 looks at the Visegrad group of countries. So this is a group of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I think it refers to the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. And here we have our colleague Malgorzata Jakimov, who refers to institutional shaping that China tries to do in these countries, where China tries to promote the adoption of Chinese norms by host countries. Similar evidence of institution shaping is offered by Nicholas Crawford's study of the Western Balkans. That's in chapter 7, where Nicholas shows us how China tries to shape Serbia's foreign policy through its presence, but of course he also says it's very limited. So chapters 6 and 7 give us the clearest example of how China's investments might strain the liberal international order by shaping the institutional norms and preferences in the host countries. In chapter 3, we are told about the way in which China might strain the liberal international order in a country where there is an existing, what they call a multiplier effect. Meaning, and this is done through a study of Hungary, meaning there are existing illiberal political and economic actors in place which are strengthened by Chinese investments in Hungary. So the Hungarian example shows that such terms as special relationships between China and Hungary might align and amplify preferences that tend towards illiberalism in both China and Hungary. So it's not that China is creating a new set of preferences in Hungary. There are existing what you might call illiberal practices, which have a multiplier effect because you have a convergence of two like-minded political investments. The third way in which Chinese investments strain the liberal international order, but to a very limited extent, comes up in chapter 4 on Italy, where Filippo Boni's study finds an uptake among some, but not all, political elites of China's narrative. So China, of course, Italy became one of the G7 countries that really acceded to the BRI and then very quickly exited as well. But Italian political elites, some Italian political elites were seen to be towing the Chinese line on key issues such as Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Filippo suggests that there is a discursive persuasion at work. But again, that was very limited. The attempts to persuade Italy were very limited because we also know that Italy exited the BRI within 2 years of joining it. So there was only up to a limited extent that China could really influence Italy. Beyond that, the Italians said, "We're out. We don't want to have anything to do with this." And the fourth way in which China might strain the liberal international order is by its attempt to prevail. And here it's important to think about the attempt to prevail rather than successfully prevailing over countries such as Greece. And that's the example in chapter 5, where Chinese investments may result in a short-term change of behavior. So in Greece, we see for a limited period, Greece voting in international forums in favor of China. But after a point, the Greeks were like, please don't push us anymore. So Greece, of course, famously hosts the Piraeus port. There's a huge Chinese investment in the Piraeus port in Greece, which has been touted as the gateway into Europe. And Greece has welcomed that investment, but has refused to play along with China after a point because of the feeling that the Chinese are being too overbearing. So we have these 4 different ways in which Chinese investments may strain the liberal international order, and you see them in varying extents. We find that they strain the liberal international order the most where they're able to multiply existing preferences. So not where they are creating new preferences, but where existing illiberal preferences already exist. Part 3 of the book illustrates the ways in which Chinese investments in Europe may, in fact, unanticipatedly and unintendedly strengthen the liberal international order. For example, our Simona Davidescu shows that China's investments in nuclear power in Romania actually galvanized the United States to emerge as an alternative investor in a geoeconomically sensitive region. And the US brought with it its own sort of ways of, questions of transparency and accountability in order to challenge the Chinese presence. Jan Neurig, who looks at Chinese MNCs in Germany, tells us about how Chinese investments may try to shape domestic politics in Germany, but their very presence actually provokes vigilance among German ombudspeople, which limits the impact of any such effects. And finally, according to Catherine Jones, again, I'm sorry if it's sort of gone down below, China's investments elsewhere in the global south spur European donors to make their own programs of development aid much more effective and fit for purpose. So they cannot take it for granted that they'll be the only agents or only donor agencies, but they also see they have competition. And therefore, they are much more careful about how they go about their development programs. So, in terms of the key takeaways from our work, we would like to emphasize, if you wanted just the 4 or 5 elevator points from the work. The first, that when we think about power, power is not only about one's economic or military or ideational resources, it's also about how those resources are translated into influence. The second, and related to this, is if there is such a thing as Chinese grand strategy. We don't think there is, our contributors don't think there is, but if there is such a thing, it is not terribly influential. And it's certainly not influential enough to undermine the liberal international order. This, of course, is not a case for complacence. If you are a defender of the liberal international order, that this does not mean you just sit back and say everything is fine, because we also know historically empires are rarely the product of grand strategy. I mean, if you think of the British Empire in 1750, and if you talk to anyone in the streets of London, just think about whether there was a British grand strategy to take over Asia and Africa, they would scoff at you because they didn't really know what was going on in their own palace. But we know 200 years later where what was sort of the largest empire the contemporary world has seen. So there are many sources of threats to the liberal international order. China is one minor factor among others. So this is not to say that it all is well with the liberal international order, but if you're going to look at China as the source of threat, you might be looking at the wrong sort of villain in that sense. We also, our key takeaway is that state-society interactions within countries matter to global politics. So there's a bottom-up way of thinking about global politics, where we're not really thinking about what happens in Washington or Moscow or Beijing, for that matter, or in the halls of the United Nations, but what goes on within states and societies in different parts of the world that make a difference to global politics. And it's the dynamic interaction between the preferences and behaviors of different states and societies that will ultimately salvage or undermine the liberal international order, rather than what President Xi or President Biden or any of the sort of leaders of the world like to think. So I stop here. I mean, I might sort of put some pointers towards future research agenda that is emerging from this work. We are, based on this work, which is got us to really think about China's rise and what it means. We are also interested to look towards looking at global responses to China's rise, because there's a great deal of tendency to only focus on what China is doing, as I said, but we, on the basis of this work, would like to look further at what's happening elsewhere. The Indo-Pacific is one obvious region to focus on because of the ways in which non-China actors in Asia seem to have gotten together. The second agenda from this work, to take this work forward, is to think about the many manifestations of multipolarity China, of course, likes to talk of itself as a multipolar actor, and that's not far from the truth. But there are lots of other actors who you might call, part of Southern multilateralism, who are non-China global South actors who are sort of also getting their act together. And the third major sort of direction in which further research would go is to think beyond a state-centric approach to multipolarity, what the scholar Amitav Acharya calls multiplexity, where you think about state-society interactions across the world and how they make for global politics. And I would like to close with advanced praise that the work has received and any questions or thoughts that people might have. Thank you so much for your attention. I didn't expect this audience, so thank you for this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Indrajit. We now have about 40 minutes for Q&A. So please raise your hands, and if you need help in asking questions in English, please ask your questions in Nepali. I will translate them for Indrajit. How much Nepali do you understand?
Only.
So yeah, Pramod.
So I was thank you very much for this presentation. It was wonderful. Going through the three paths, the three arguments that you make, I was particularly struck by the second one. Like how the rising China is, in a sense, trying to interfere with the liberal international order. The examples that you give, from the chapters, I mean, in a sense, these are all countries that have transitioned, from a different political order to this new international, the liberal international order. So in that sense, if we were to take the case of, countries which have had this belief in this LIO for a longer time. So what would be, the extent of the Chinese interference with the liberal international order, for example, say in Germany or in the UK or in France, as compared to Poland or Serbia or Hungary?
Excellent question. Do you want me to take the questions one or collect questions?
No.
Yes.
I prefer it this way.
Absolutely. No, I think you're right. In some ways, you would expect, given that there are within Europe, there's a range, as you said, of political developments that have happened over the last 3 decades or so. That there is you can expect something like a multiplier effect in the countries that were under socialism, or that you would call post-socialist countries. And I think because of, and Hungary was a good example, because the Hungarian Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party have party links that go back decades. Serbia, as part of the former Yugoslavia, looks back at that era of socialist brotherhood. So there is that language that you could say possibly gives some opportunities for Chinese actors to think that they may be able to politically influence developments in the host country. But I think there is a complication in the fact that it's not just the Chinese Communist Party that we're talking about. There are also other Chinese actors, China's state-owned enterprises, who may not be great fans of the Chinese Communist Party themselves. So the domestic competition between these different actors in China does play out in the host countries. I think the party would like to think that it will be able to, persuade governments in Hungary or in Serbia to vote for, in favor of China in international sort of forums. They might think that they would like to be able to, ensure that communist parties or authoritarian parties sort of rule, but there's very little evidence to show that there's an active attempt to intervene in domestic politics, because what the Chinese investors like more than anything else is, in terms of Chinese investments in, say, Western Europe, Germany and Britain especially, not through financial investments, which is our focus, but through what you might call cultural investments, such as the Confucian Institutes, for example. But again, the evidence that this has actually led to any change is so little, is so thin, because the moment you have a Confucian Institute, I mean, you may not be able to say anything about Taiwan, for instance, Confucian Institutes are doing. that there is not really much success in terms of shaping public opinion that the Chinese are. So if they're trying, they're going about it the wrong way. But who knows what they're really interested in. Financially, you're right. I mean, there's a general assumption that in the Eastern European countries, China thinks that they might be able to sort of win over host governments, but there's too much of a lot of the domestic competition plays out in overseas markets as well. But thank you, that's a great question. Thank you.
Your question?
First thing I would like to ask is about like the impact of aid, about impact of aid, that whenever a country tries to give aid and when you invest, and then you start to interfere in a country's internal issues that I've seen, like in Nepal taking aid from India, from US, and then the aid itself have a reverse effect. Now people see that these countries are coming over here, they see it as a threat. So it have a negative impact over the influence. The second thing is, does it actually help the liberal international order? Because in my own country's case, I've seen that whenever the aid comes, the aid goes from a democracy to an autocracy. Now the autocrats get money from America, they get money from China, and now because they're competing, they cannot force a country to be democratic. They help military. Whoever can will support military. And third is the issue.
Can you, which country were you referring to as autocratic country?
Nepal was Punjab was autocracy. Punjab was autocracy. 1960 to 1990, Punjab was an autocracy.
Let's keep it abstract. We get the point. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So
that's great. Yes.
The US and China doesn't have any reason to go in war, but Taiwan is one issue which is playing the game, and how the Taiwan issue is going to play in this entire spread, because the entire Chinese mechanism believes Taiwan should be a part of China, and the investment is going to be, this has already been introduced, but how do you see this impact of this investment trying to force country to have less deals with Taiwan? Thank you.
Thank you. Again, a great set of questions. You want me to take them? There were three quite separate, but I'll take them. But I think they're all linked, and it's I think also helps to clarify. So a lot of the investments we're talking about are of course financial investments. They're not aid. But you're right that what's often called aid seems to be quite illiberal, especially because it goes from democracies to autocracies, however you define it. The assumption, however, is that aid from liberal democracies would nudge states towards democracy. That's the assumption, and it may be a flawed assumption, but that's an assumption. That was the assumption, say, behind a lot of the aid that went to Myanmar, for example. It ended up with quite disastrous and catastrophic results, we know, but the assumption often is that, so it's not just about the US or US actors making money. There is an ideological belief that aid from democracies to autocracies, at least if you see it from the point of view of Washington liberals, there is an assumption that such aid will nudge countries towards democracies. We've seen this across the world, that this does not happen. But I think our colleague who looks at the impact of China's own aid practices suggests that in a paradoxical sort of way, the very competition between two different aid givers, forces everyone to become more vigilant vis-a-vis the others, and it offers donors the choice. It offers receiving countries the choice between one or the other. So we don't have to say China good, West bad, or the other way around, West good, China bad, to see that there is some competition between donors that always helps people at the bottom to really be able to pull strings or to play one against the other. And colleagues who worked on China's investments in various African countries or China's aid to different African countries will say that Angola constantly plays China against Western donors. It's a strategy that, say, India used to do back in the 1960s, when between the US and the USSR, they would constantly play one against the other. And it helped India that the US and the USSR were at crosshairs. Moscow and Washington were hardly talking in the way that Washington and Beijing are hardly talking. So I think from a recipient country point of view, it's good to have donors who are constantly competing with each other, because then you can leverage one against the other. And if liberal international order is about competition, about freedom of these sorts of exchanges, then you could say, ironically, unintentionally and paradoxically that the US-China competition actually strengthens it rather than weakens it, although not in the way that either party would have liked. On Taiwan, I mean, I don't have a clear view except that obviously there is everyone's talking about a coming war. But I don't think the war is necessarily between China and the US. I think in all of this, the equation between China's immediate neighbors in Asia is often ignored. And that's where a lot of the action really is. I don't think and I'm not an expert, but based on colleagues' work, it's not really the US's actions that we need to look out for, but to think about what the Philippines, what the Vietnams, what other neighbors of China will do. So that's where I think thinking about the Indo-Pacific makes much more sense. Not as from a geostrategic perspective, which is what Washington would like, but from the perspective of states and societies in Asia. I think that's where the action really is. Thank you.
I know, great talk. Some normative similarities obviously with Nepal as well. I suppose quite a few questions, but I don't know whether it's part of the book anyway. First is, I'd like to know how much of an influence has the US and its, let's say, technology control laws have had on, let's say, Europe's reaction or negation of China's investments, all of that, right? Of course, the Dutch and the US, that's a separate case, but of course, with Germany, France, they see some differences with how the US responds to these technology control laws are. I don't know whether that's covered in your research or not. The second point about, I'm very interested in understanding, you're saying that already China has invested in, let's say, Greece, right? In port, and Greece for a time, sort of, where the Chinese political influence also comes in to support its stand in multilateral forums, right? And you're saying that Greece, after a point, refused to do that stand. So could you define how it particularly did that? And is there a sort of difference again? And I suppose this is a different question, but also related. That do you see how, let's say, the development or the economic development of countries matters to how they respond to China in terms of, let's say, upholding the LIO or not, like agreeing to, let's say, more automatic measures?
Excellent question. I think the Greece question is relatively easy to respond to because our colleague looked at voting patterns, for example, and not only support for Chinese positions in multilateral forums, but also Greece's positions vis-a-vis the European Union. And for a while, both seem to go hand in hand. So Greece very much supportive of China, very critical of the European Union. And in the earliest days after the pandemic, for instance, which is a few years after Piraeus Port came into existence, there was a great deal of criticism within some of the southern European countries about how little they had been helped by the EU, but how China was sort of quick to fly in. That enthusiasm evaporates very quickly because although then Greece starts to becoming very lukewarm vis-a-vis Chinese sort of positions internationally, they may not oppose China, but they don't support it either, and there's always the possibility of abstention, for example. And then you see a very warming up towards the European Union as a strategy. So instead of being overtly critical, there's much more of a, well, after all, they are our neighbors, and we are part of Europe. I mean, there's no talk about sort of becoming one again, but there's less criticism that you saw. So I think when they were looking at the measuring the change, it's the discursive sort of element that kicks in, and that has practical consequences as well, I think. So I think and Greece is interesting because as a small country, you would expect in terms of questions of agency, etc., not that it doesn't have a great deal of it, but of course it does, and it's able to resist any attempt that might have been to get it to vote one way or the other in international forums.
Was there a trigger?
A trigger against?
No, a trigger for Greece to change its position vis-a-vis.
I mean, the chapter suggests that there was domestic political opposition, for example, that felt that Greece was too, going too sort of much in favor, that the government was going too much in favor. I think the question about the levels of economic development, in some ways, the answer might suggest yes, because, well, the more economically developed you are, the more you're able to resist, and that sort of very standard relationships that are made between economic development and political sort of autonomy. But again, systematically, we haven't done that sort of work, and nobody who sort of looked at the questions of economic development and levels of political autonomy would say that there's a direct correlation. But we do see, as I responded earlier, that in Western and Central Europe, countries that have enjoyed longer levels of economic development, of course, they are able to hold on further. So there might be a relationship, but it would be anecdotal rather than very sort of scientifically causal, sort of using the regression analysis. I think your point about the US policies regarding communications or superconductors or any of those sort of longer, broader term, more strategic sorts of investments is interesting. It's not something our chapters look at specifically, but in previous forums, we had colleagues who have worked on the US investments in the semiconductor industry, for instance, who've said that the US investment in those sectors is so total and so large that in some ways China is absolutely no competition. So that may well have resulted in countries that are typically or traditionally considered US allies to be not really worried about Chinese presence. And so it might be a few sort of journals who are talking about the scramble for Europe, etc. But when you look at the US dominance over that sector, at least, is just so total, it's so complete that there's absolutely nothing to worry.
Has that, stance, this new American stance, has that also influenced state choices vis-a-vis China?
It's not likely to have influenced it so much because, of course, the European governments are also quite, proud of their autonomy vis-a-vis the US. So it's not likely. It's not likely that it's a US influence that over Europe that has won out vis-a-vis Chinese influence, because then I think we'd be falling into that trap of great power competition again. These states have a great deal of agency, and you might say that the Western European states are perhaps, they're able to exert their agency even more than the others. So I wouldn't fall into that trap. I would avoid that.
Thank you. I came a little late, but I have a query. Since you're talking about liberal international order, I was wondering if your research sort of looks into this. The liberal international order was stitched together, led by Britain and then the Americans, but you had a coalition of states, supporting liberal international order. So Chinese, when you look at the Chinese, are Chinese sort of trying to stitch that kind of a coalition? Because, say, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese, one very visible, but other, smaller kind of countries being stitched together so that some form of international order can be projected by these.
Excellent question. That's not something we address in this book, but it's something I've worked on, other research that I've done on what I call Southern multilateralism, where you look at these attempts to stitch together, but they don't necessarily come from China. But let's just step back. I think there's now a great deal of research that suggests that what we call the liberal international order. So the origin myth is that it was a pact between Churchill and Roosevelt, and they met in an island somewhere. But a great deal of new research suggests that, well, whatever might have gone on there, the anti-colonial struggles that were happening around the same time were, in fact, they were the ones that really brought the liberal international order into being, rather than elite pacts between Churchill and Roosevelt. So that's one part of the story, but it is so complex and nuanced, we don't want to get into that here, because a book, after all, can only answer one or a couple of specific sets of questions rather than cover everything. So we take the liberal international order as given by liberals themselves, as defined by liberals themselves, which is the story that you're telling us, and which is widely prevailing. In terms of the ability to stitch together alliances and stuff, China, scholars have pointed to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is supposed to be this authoritarian compact against the liberal democracies. But you have so many characters in the Shanghai Cooperative Organization that you can no longer call it a cohesive front against democracy per se, but maybe the original actors, the Chinas and the Russians, do have a great deal that they would like to see against liberal democracies. But China is also part of other kinds of multilateral alliances, such as, for instance, the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, which is anything but authoritarian in the sense you might have Russia in the new development bank, but after the invasion of Ukraine, the BRICS bank actually suspended aid to Russia. So Russia is sitting in the new development bank as one of the founders, but they can do nothing to prevent it being from literally blacklisted, because there's no aid being given to Russia from that bank. And the BRICS bank is interesting, and I've written about this in this work that I call Southern Multilateralism, because it has China and India and Brazil and South Africa. And China and India are working together in the BRICS bank, even as their troops are facing off in the Himalayas. So it's one of those frenemy sort of situations where, of course, the Chinese and the Indians won't call each other friends, but are they really enemies if they're sitting in the same sort of forum and discussing who to give aid to next? And I think India gets the largest, as with the World Bank, India gets the largest chunk of aid from the BRICS bank as well. So I'm not sure it's China trying to stitch that together. It's much more likely the Brazil, South Africa, India that are trying to stitch that together. And they realize that it's useful to have China on your side, because without that, you would end up like what used to be called, I don't know if you remember, the IPSA fund, the India, Brazil, South Africa fund, which was very nice and sweet, but no one really took it seriously. And the moment you had China in it, then everyone sort of got up and said, oh, well, something's happening. So again, to go back to what I was trying to say at the end of the presentation, I think it's useful to think beyond US, China, to look at the other actors and their agency in stitching some of these things together. So I'm not sure I answered your question as well as you would have liked, but that's all I can offer. Thanks. Thanks.
I was thinking, as you were talking, as somebody who's put together quite a few edited volumes, this one looked like a very coherent edited volume.
Was it really? Is that your question?
No.
And is this being recorded?
Since I've not seen the book, you can only answer that. But so part of my question is, did a lot go into designing the book? Because in edited volumes, a lot of times, and there are several people around the room who put together edited volumes, a lot of times, even with best intentions, the volume begins to look less coherent because of things that the editors themselves cannot control. One contributor drops off, or we don't get reprint permissions in the case of books where other articles that have been previously published were initially intended for the volume but had to be dropped because the publisher wants $600 for permission. So that. But as somebody who does not know too much about the field about which you were talking, I mean, there are two questions, right? One is, with reference to part one of the book, you referred to two colleagues who used Chinese sources to make the case that there was the domestic politics in China between bureaucracies was so messy, there was no grand strategy. So let's put that in place. And then you gave the example of the East India Company saying 1750, if somebody had asked the same question, there was no grand strategy. Now, but is this related to the way in which you've defined power? In the way in which you've said, we look at power in terms of influence, not military strength. I have friends, I have actually a text here from somebody who texted me a few weeks ago saying, if China does not slow down, there is definitely going to be world war. Now, you could say this is hyperbole, but when I was in college, and I'm a little old, so this was still at the time when the Soviet Empire was still alive, and Ronald Reagan was the president in the US. I had one economics professor who was an expert on the Soviet economy. He had done his PhD at Harvard. He still had an affiliation with Harvard when he was teaching at Brandeis. We used to say, basically, that the Soviet Union was a third world country, like Nepal, who just happened to have nuclear weapons, right? Now, for people like my friend who texted me, the difference between what this professor used to tell me in the mid-1980s and what he's telling me now is that in terms of GDP, or however you might want to count the strength of countries' economies, the scene is different. So that if there is a Cold War now, the scene is different, and people who follow US military strategies are now also suggesting that the US military strategists are quite afraid of the Chinese military capabilities, developments, etc. So is there an implication in the way in which you've defined power, saying, well, we're not going to look at military strength with respect to the conclusions you gave us at the end? This might not be an excellent question.
No, it's an excellent question. It is a really helpful question because it goes to the heart of how you make sense of global China. And you're absolutely right. I think the story behind China's rise is not just its military strength, but its economic strength. Because at its peak, the Soviet Union's GDP was, I think, less than half of America's GDP at its peak in the 1960s. Whereas China, as we know, is at par, if not, expected to exceed. Unlike the USSR, the US and the China are enmeshed in economic relations. There's trade that happens both ways, and we know the story about markets. So I think it's an excellent question because it might look like we've sidestepped a very key aspect of defining power to thinking about influence. But our response to that, and the reason we chose to think about power as influence rather than power as an enumeration of resources is so what? So what if China has all the sorts of things that it has in terms of military resources, in terms of its economic ability to reach out? Is it able to use all that in its own favor? Is it able to use its military resources in its own favor? Is it able to use its economic resources in its own favor? If it's not able to convince smaller countries, for instance, that China has their best interests in mind, or that the smaller countries should, behave in a way that you would like, classic understandings of power. What's the point? You can sit on loads and loads of ammunition, nuclear ammunition, and that's what it is, just a waste of all your investments, because you've not been able to translate any of that into influence. And so we are not really concerned about how much resources China has. We are concerned about how it's able to translate that into influence. And if you think about that way of, and you're right, of course, definitions matter, but we think this is a more useful way to define power than to enumerate GDP per capita. I mean, so what? Qatar has the world's largest GDP per capita. So what? So it's a so what question that really got us to think about power as influence and whether or not China is able to translate any of that into influence. And therefore, we, in terms of addressing some of the anxieties, some of the concerns, I think a lot of the work around China's sort of growing resources, etc., almost borders on fear-mongering, because it's not about China's intentions. We're not looking at China's intentions. We're looking at its ability to translate all of that into action. The BRI was a good example for us because everyone you sort of meet or who writes about the BRI talks about the BRI as almost a grand strategy for world takeover. But if you look at how the BRI was put together in the first place, it's a bunch of infrastructure projects in Western China, which then retrospectively was given branded as the Belt and Road Initiative, which then retrospectively was suggested that this is China's sort of grand Marshall Plan and a way to offer as a public good, which is great from the standpoint of President Xi, but is that what really happens? And that tells you a lot about how China is able to even translate a project like that into actual influence. So when we looked at Greece's sort of the Piraeus port, for instance, one would expect that this is a port which China has such a huge stake over, and that they might be able to influence Greece in lots of ways, but that just didn't happen. Or Italy, which became the G7 country to join the BRI, soon exited because they weren't going to take it. So all of China's stockpile, all of China's GDP is actually worth not a lot if it's not able to translate that into influencing countries to at least like it or go for it. And we're not even talking about social attitudes. We're not even talking about the Pew Research surveys which show how much public opinion has sort of turned against China in different countries. And it may well be that it's other sort of actors at work, groups that are actively waging propaganda against China. It may well be that. But at the end of the day, if power is about how you influence others rather than all the resources that you have, which we think is a more useful way of thinking about power, what's the point?
Yes, please.
On the follow-up of this answer to this question. Do you also, when you say state actors in the Communist Party, and we are talking about a sort of disalignment between military might and that not really translating into its economic aid or financial investment, do you also look at how and why these are not in alignment? What do we actually mean by the state actors in China or Communist parties?
Yeah.
You know, what are the theories behind BRI? Why is it not a military advancement when international liberal order is probably also a result of the US pointing a gun and giving some money? So how is this not working together? Because again, they have the resources, financial, even military. So what stops them from using them?
I think our colleagues who worked on the first part of the chapter of the book, the way they look at domestic politics within China, UG has what she calls the bureaucratic politics model, for instance, where she looks at how you have the Communist Party, but you also have bureaucrats, civil servants who have been recruited by a variety of means, and you have state-owned enterprises which have varying levels to which the state is invested in those enterprises. So her response would be, for instance, and the chapter sort of looks at. I mean, she says that it's pointless looking for a theoretical model, but what really you have to look out for is how the different actors have been brought into place, what the different factions within the Communist Party are, what the different factions within the bureaucracy are, who is aligned and affiliated with whom. So her theoretical response would be the bureaucratic politics model, which makes sense if you think about how, as we know, the state is never a homogeneous, monolithic. Any state, not just the Chinese state, any state is never homogeneous and monolithic. You have various factions and actors within those. And within China, you have factions within the bureaucracy, within the Chinese Communist Party, and within state-owned enterprises. So that would be one theoretical answer, I think, that the book would offer. We don't think we have one theoretical model for the entire, sort of, which covers the entire book, obviously, because it's an edited volume. And as Pratyush said, we didn't, one of the reasons we might have been successful is because I wouldn't say we were relatively successful, is because we didn't impose a theoretical model at all. And in that respect, you could say it was very empiricist, in the sense it was very ground up, it was based on different country specializations. And so we did have a few set of questions that we, hoped all chapters would answer, but those were not around theories or application of theories. And nobody objected to the bureaucratic politics model, which was only used for the first chapter. Nobody said, I don't want to be part of a book which uses this model. So that may have been also, to respond to your question as well as to your sort of comment earlier, may have been one reason we were able to navigate the diverse sorts of pressures. The others, I mean, we did use the state in society approach, as I mentioned, which was broad, relatively broad, but we stripped it of its Marxist connotations because it has a very Marxist sort of element to it. And we said, you don't become Marxist if, this is in the introduction, so everyone was happy with it. And that's how, but it sort of made sense to think about bureaucratic politics, how the bureaucratic politics was embedded within society.
No, I was just a continuation, right? Like, I mean, I want to understand, like, okay, influence.
Yeah.
You're looking at Chinese influence, and I'm assuming from your emphasis on investments, so investments and influence.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is the sort of? I just want to think about the findings here. Like, do you find that? All right, is there a sort of a pattern that emerges with, let's say, large-scale SOE investments, or is there a different sort of a pattern that comes out? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, in the sense, there's no pattern. That's the story. There is no pattern, and the size of the SOE does not matter. If you think about
this investment,
if you think about the agency of the host country, that's what matters. So it doesn't matter how big the SOE is. It doesn't matter how big the state-owned enterprise is. What matters is the extent to which the host country, states and societies are able to coherently respond or not. So the focus is really the other way around. And the reason the focus is to turn the question on its head is because so much of what is written about Chinese investments is about what China is doing, or what President Xi is doing, or what Beijing thinks, rather than thinking about what is going on in the host states.
No, but from the host side as well, I'm just thinking about, does the scale of investment create its own channels of influence?
Possibly,
You know?
possibly, yes. And I think
does that affect agency as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It does, but we have to keep in mind the prior sorts of organizations in those states. So if you have a large state-owned enterprise, for instance, which is Greece again is a great example. You have Cisco, you have a state-owned enterprise, very large, and you would expect that they might be able to push through, but they can't because of Greece's domestic political coalitions being what it is, and the way in which they are able to, or in the Greek case, they were able to put forward a front across political spectrum, saying, well, limit yourself to just being an investor rather than trying to interfere and dictate to us how we should vote. So I think I think it's the agency that would matter, the agency of states and societies that would matter.
I know, so when you replied back to me, I was a bit surprised by the fact that you had done a China book.
Many people were.
So just like Umarji, myself, many people in the room, we are kind of like Nepal area scholars, right? So I thought you'd say, I was pretty sure you'd agree to give a talk here, but I thought you'd speak about something related to India. So it made me think. Now in the bio note you sent me, you said rising powers is one of your research scholarly interests. Now I was just also thinking, based on just the China-related research that's happening today, compared to when I was in college and in graduate school, I subscribe to this H note that comes out of the University of Michigan. Right? Now, in each edition of that, there are several announcements, and more than half of them are related to China. So, I'm not saying every academic, strategizes and says, okay, how am I going to score points regarding how to get promoted in my university? I'm not saying that. Things happen that necessarily you don't plan. Somebody says, okay, let's do this book, you collaborate and the book happens. And there are many people in this room who've gone through that experience. So is the rising power thing also something that political scientists in the UK, we're now based in the UK academic system, having to respond to directly or indirectly, whether there is REF or not, meaning this research excellence framework happening in the background. So where does this come from? And this is a personal question.
This is a very good question. I'm very glad you asked this because there's a deep history to this. So let's answer this in a two-track way. Let's give what you might call an intellectual answer, and then we get to the personal answer, because this is a personal question, a deeply personal question. Intellectually, I think if you think about my earliest work, which I presented here, you think about Politics of the Poor, and the key argument of that book is that what happens at the bottom of society matters. Power is not something that is always exerted from the top, but power is also about how you use, navigate, and sort of push things upwards. How poor people are able to navigate local elites, for example, how they're able to access welfare programs, for instance. That was the premise of Politics of the Poor. Thinking about power and thinking about how power is not only not only top down, but also bottom up. And as my own research sort of developed, this question of power has remained sort of quite key to thinking about how power works not only at the level of an Indian village, but also whether the same dynamics operate globally or the same dynamics operate nationally and comparatively. So the question of power has sort of been quite central to how I've been thinking about politics and how I've been thinking about development. And because development is, of course, not just as your work has showed, and as we know, is not just about technical interventions, but it's also about how it's appropriated by different actors and how different actors negotiate it, resist it, or use it to their own benefit. Subsequent to the book, I worked with colleagues on thinking about how poor people's politics may have shaped national policy. So, for instance, if you think about welfare policy in India and you look at, say, parliamentary debates, and you think about how much of a reference those debates make to poor people and their relevance. Now, I'm not saying that poor people necessarily marched to parliament and demanded that you have social welfare programs, but through their electoral politics, through their contentious politics, they made life, well, a little interesting for their politicians, so that they were, they had no option but to pass welfare regime programs in countries like India. But also I worked with colleagues who worked on similar processes in Brazil, in Turkey, and that's where the rising power sort of element came up, because these were all countries which had a certain level of economic growth, which is what is associated with rising power status. It's not just about military rise, but it's much more about economic growth as well. And that took me to the question, the moment you talk about rising powers, you cannot ignore China. And of course, that's where the China story becomes interesting. You mentioned REF. Actually, people told me that if I stuck to India, I would make much more of a REF contribution. Because of course, that would allow me to sail through publications and, would able to get me high impact journals. And this book actually is not refable in that sense, because the REF requires you to do everything by yourself. So if anything is co-authored, it falls within the REF rank. And if it's co-edited, it's even less, because they say you brought together people. So what's the big deal? So in a way, and this is where the personal story comes in a way, this is a product of just wanting to break out of a mode which restricts you just because you have brown skin and you're from the global south, restricts you to the global south and says you please just stick to your lane and don't sort of work anywhere else. And that was a personal challenge, because if you think about, at the moment when I was sort of getting a job, there was a lot of talk around decolonizing of politics, decolonizing social sciences, decolonize this, decolonize that. And that's great, but then you start asking, okay, what does it actually look like to decolonize? What does it actually look like? What sorts of work should we do? So we should criticize, of course, but we also need to build. And I have a lot of regard for colleagues who work on decolonizing, but sometimes it seemed as if the colonial power had all the power and that all of us were stripped of agency, which is where the question of agency comes. So when I first put in a grant for this work internally, actually they rejected it, saying you don't, exactly as you might have been on the committee for all we know, because they say, well, you work on India, why are you interested here? And there were lots of things. I know this is being recorded, so I'll be careful about the exchange with my own department. Long story short, they were supportive at the end, but there was a bit of an uncomfortable situation. Of course, once you got people together, we were fortunate that none of my contributors thought it was a problem that I had brown skin and was working on India and was therefore sort of encroaching into their territories. I think what worked was we were all early career scholars. They all knew that this would not necessarily be a ref point, but I think the motivation to think about Chinese investments in Europe from the perspective of development studies actually helped, because here was a developing country with its growing influence entering into developed country investors that actually got everyone interested. So not all our contributors are development studies people, many of them are international studies, IR, global politics, comparative politics, whatnot, but this angle that China in Europe is not just about another rich sort of country which is investing elsewhere, but it's profoundly different from what we have seen so far and is likely to open up pathways which are effectively decolonization, as the term is understood. But of course, there are lots of other things that decolonization entails. But here was a profound transformation in the world in which we lived. And that the global order itself was changing, and it would be, well, silly not to capture this moment, given where we were, given our, collaborative commitments. They were all very good humored about it, and I'm very grateful that they all sort of, stuck to deadlines. They, delivered their chapters on time. We didn't have a dropout, to be honest, not a single dropout, recognizing that this was not going to help them in their ref thing. So I think it was really just about a collaborative, sense of camaraderie that we've got involved. We had one or two people, but they were really early career, and so we didn't really expect them to take on because they had jobs to sort of get. So we were just at the right, we all had more or less permanent jobs, and we said, okay, we're doing other things, but this is one chapter, it'll lend itself to other things, let's just put together. We had critical reviewers, but they were also constructive, so they told us what we could do to strengthen it, and OUP was very quick with, getting the reviews, getting everything in place. So I think we just got lucky, and that would be a nice way, I think, to close the question about why personally I was interested. But yeah, it's a deeply personal story, and you've touched a raw nerve, which I shall talk about more when we are not in camera.
I just want to ask the Chinese regions, the Central and Eastern European country, the 17 plus 1 or 16 plus 1 or 20 like what. So what is the impact now? How is it functioning, and is the war in Ukraine impacting in any way, or do other factors are impacting it, like Lithuania is out of that, and I think the other Latvia and Estonia is out of that.
Yeah.
So I think we are trying to maybe divide Europe, EU into and working in its own designs, and how much impact that the countries moving out of that has made on that place.
So, Chinese investments have continued, and in some ways there are very key infrastructure projects that China has supported. You have the Budapest-Belgrade Road Railway, for example, which connects Central and Southern Europe throughout, and although you had dropouts from other sort of large infrastructure projects, those that have been approved have continued. They're doing well financially, but the initial scare or worry that this would all result in Europe turning authoritarian, or that politically it would sort of create an upheaval. There is political upheaval in Europe, but you cannot attribute it to Chinese investments. There are domestic political actors who are at work. So economically, I think it's, in terms of the returns to investment, it's not spectacularly more advanced than what had been expected, but it has not been a loss either. And you're right, some countries have decided to opt out, but that happens with every economic sort of system. It's not like a political, accession in that sense. But in terms of returns, it's not been too disappointing. But the hope or fear that the investments would turn into political support, I think that is so vastly exaggerated. And you can see that even more now, after the pandemic, with how people's attitudes have sort of been really against Chinese presence. It's obviously, if they did intend to win people over, they weren't doing a good job.
Thank you. It doesn't look like there are any more questions. So thank you for this very clear presentation.
Yes. And thank you for asking these questions. It was very helpful. Yes.
So अब अरू कार्यक्रमहरुमा पनि आउनु होला। यो आउने आइतबार चाहिँ सपनाहरुको अवसर, बसाइसराई र नेपाल सरकारको नयाँ सहर अवधारणा र अब आउने मंगलबार चाहिँ किन हराउँदैछन् पानीका स्रोत। थ्यांक यू।